We began this discussion last time, and we were talking about the factors that have contributed to China's growth, various developments in terms of economic policy of China, and also the behavior of international investors that has contributed to it. Fortunately, today is not too hot. Very close. Okay, so one of the attractions of China for international investors was the affordability of skilled, cheap labor. Because China had invested in its education, there was plenty of educated labor at the level of high school primarily, which was well trained and it had enjoyed good health, therefore it was productive labor. And the wages were relatively stable. Why were they stable? Because there was a large supply of workers. When industrial countries that needed labor, as the demand for labor increased because of the foreign investment, people were migrating from rural areas and coming to fill all the factory jobs that were needed. And the government facilitated that. The labor was affordable, it had good skills and good work ethics. So that made China an ideal place to serve as a manufacturing base for international companies. Another factor that contributed to China's growth as far as attracting investments was the agglomeration benefit, meaning that means just concentration of a large number of firms in one area that are doing the same, producing the same thing. Because as you produce more and more of a product, the labor market becomes more efficient in that community. Take, for example, of New York, which is the financial center of the world. It is a very expensive city to set up a financial institution. But still everyone wants to be in New York City. Why? Because you can find very good talent. And not only there is competition, but there are occasionally networking and communication. Why? Because there are so many financial firms in a small local area. That's what we call agglomeration. So that was happening because there were a number of coastal hotspots, hubs, centers where producers of the same product, for example, electronic products, automobile parts, were all going and investing there, and there were a large number of them. And then the stability of wages. The process began in 1980, and all the way for nearly 30 years, output was growing, production was growing, but because there was this large supply of workers that were available, the wages were stable. Therefore, production in China remained profitable. Not only wages were stable, but labor was not radical. Laborers would not go on strike. It was not part of the tradition of China, and the political system did not allow the workers to unionize and bargain. Therefore, there was a stability in that sense as well. Okay, so if you look at the statistics for wages, you can see how the real wages changed in this period. So nominal wages can increase because obviously you have inflation and wages keep up with inflation. But what matters is the adjusted value of wage after inflation. That is called real wage. wage. And look at this dark black line. Very stable. The growth rate of wages was very, very moderate, below 4% for a long time. However, at the same time, when we come forward, you can see that in terms of prosperity and the standard of living, even though wages were growing slowly, the real wages were growing enough so that the workers were really enjoying the rising standard of living. Look at this bars, orange bars. This is in yuan. It shows how the wages were increasing. And this line shows the annual growth rate of wages. And therefore, there was some growth in prosperity. And furthermore, this graph is only for one segment of the labor market. It is the urban non-private unit, which means state-owned enterprises. The private sector that serve the international investments also enjoyed an increase in wages, reflecting an improvement in the standard of living. Okay, so part of that was realized because of China's investment in health and education. As you can see here, the basic steps in education and health were taken even starting in the 1960s, even before the major reforms were introduced. And that meant that the young working group in the population, people between the ages of, let's say, 18 and 40, had already enjoyed improved health and education, and they were ready to work with good skills. Further, as we moved forward, we see that the labor conditions were affected by market incentives, because gradually the market mechanism was introduced. The rigid wages that were controlled by government were abandoned, especially in state enterprises, and obviously the private enterprises that came with foreign investment, they also adjusted the wage based on productivity, and that created incentive. But that means difference in wages. People who are more productive and more talented were able to earn more based on their talent and productivity. We observe higher education and skill levels of factory workers for given wages in China relative to competitor countries. Meaning that because of all of these government investments, investors realize if they are paying $5 an hour in real dollars, the productivity of Chinese workers for that $5 payment was higher than other countries around the region, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and elsewhere. And that became a reason for attracting investment, foreign investment. Okay, productivity growth in non-agriculture, non-state-owned sectors has been one of the most important sources of growth in China. How do we know that? Because in economics we have mechanisms to measure the contribution of different factors to output. This is, I think you're familiar with your introductory economics. So we say Q is equal to F of, for example, labor, capital, and raw materials, correct? How do we measure productivity? We can design statistical models to measure the contribution of this one separately on growth of output. So these are statements based on empirical observation. Okay, the special industrial zones in southern China benefited from proximity to Hong Kong and inflow of investments from overseas. The earlier investors in China, when it began to liberalize, one of the most important ones were communities in Asia which themselves had large Chinese communities. And those investors of Chinese origin had the advantage of knowing the language, knowing the culture. Therefore, they brought in not only investments, but the technology and the culture of production that was already available in Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and these countries. Okay, and then first a few provinces and the coastal lines attracted all of these investments. Then investment began to flow from those coastal provinces inland. And not only foreign investors, but after a couple of decades, Chinese themselves became successful investors, both state enterprises and private enterprises. So what did they do? They began to invest in other provinces that had not developed as much. So in two stages. First, some leading provinces, and then transfer of technology and investment to other provinces of China. And why would they do that? Because the cost of labor in those advanced provinces like Shanghai were rising. So it was better to bring in the kind of investment that is highly productive and requires professional labor, such as, for example, advanced computers. But if you were producing small electronics in those provinces, which required lower skilled labor, you move your investment to inland regions. And another reason for this was that some industries that were causing environmental pollution, the government of China required that those be moved elsewhere with lower population density, so investments were transferred to other provinces. Okay. As we said earlier, China did not go for fast economic reforms as recommended by, for example, IMF. What did China do? China focused on gradual transition by taking the local conditions and local culture, especially local culture of the bureaucracy, into account. In other words, the top elite realized that there is already this huge bureaucracy that's connected to the Communist Party. If we say that we want to eliminate waste in bureaucracy immediately, and we want to introduce efficient models similar to what Weber was saying, there would be resistance. There would be all kinds of revolts, resistance. So they said we'll do gradually, and we create incentives for bureaucracy to support the reforms that we want to introduce. And we talked a little bit about this, correct? We said that they created incentives so that bureaucrats would support the introduction of foreign investment rather than feeling that the rise of private sector is going to threaten their own job security. That's what we call a feasible path. Choosing what is feasible and pragmatic rather than just following radical theories of economic default. Okay. So, what was this feasible path? It said, let's make sure the transition is successful. Don't say we are going to go from A to B and just say move forward immediately. Let's see what is feasible so that we can achieve that goal. So, for example, privatization is a good objective, correct? But can we just announce that starting tomorrow we are going to privatize 100 large state corporations? Because this rapid and sudden privatization of just going towards the objective had certain risks, they said, let's see if we can find a step-by-step compromise. So what did they do? Rather than direct privatization, first the town and village enterprises were created, and the assets that belonged to the central bank were transferred to these town and village enterprises, which belonged to the local government on behalf of the community. They were still government assets, but government assets with local ownership. And that means people in that locality care. Imagine if you are a village of 1,000 people, and suddenly you realize the company that belonged to the government means to the local government. So if it's successful, you would benefit from it. So they introduced the profit incentive. And local governments were allowed to keep a share of the profits rather than simply serving as accountants and passing all the profits to the central government. This was operated in this mode of operation. This town and village enterprises were kept for a while, and as they became more successful, then the next stage of privatization began. But again, fearing that the bureaucrats might be resistant, might try to corrupt the process, the government allowed the local entrepreneurs and even managers of these enterprises to purchase portions of it, and for some firms, to purchase the whole firm. So again, the government, state bureaucracy had an incentive to support the transition. The main obstacle to privatization is often the bureaucracy and some political elites who would lose their status and their benefits if a corporation is privatized. So they found a smart way of overcoming the resistance to reform. Okay, so one of the positive outcomes of China's economic success is that it has been able to reduce the percentage of people living below the poverty line. And there are several ways of measuring poverty. One of them is in relative measures. For example, you say people below the 25% cutoff, when we distribute the poverty, anyone whose income is below the 25% cutoff for the country is considered poor. The other one is to say there is a certain amount of minimum income that people should have to survive. Anyone who makes below that would be considered poor. So one of the ways of doing that is to follow the United Nations guidelines, which says that anyone earning equivalent to $1.9 US or less, anyone earning below $1.9 US is considered poor. So this doesn't make any sense for the United States, but given the lower prices, there are actually many countries where a large portion of the population earns less than 1.9, and that's considered the standard of absolute poverty. And as you can see with these two lines, which one of them is the official poverty line that Chinese government defines, and the other one based on this $1.9 per day, we can see that China has had very good success in eliminating poverty. But introducing market mechanism and private property has had an adverse effect. It has increased inequality. That increase is unavoidable because if you want to have, for people to have incentive to work hard, you have to let them keep the profit that they generate. And then based on emotional intelligence, based on IQ, differences in society, or other resources that people might have based on family resources, some people would excel very fast, others simply stay at the level that they were. Therefore, inequality, which is measured by this index, called Gini coefficient, has increased. Gini coefficient was relatively low for China before, but now we can see that it has increased to the level which is comparable to, for example, the United States. Because US is considered a relatively unequal society. And here is the value of Gini. Higher Gini means more inequality. The name comes from the Italian economist Gini. I'm not sure what the first name is, but he was the one who introduced it, so it's called Gini coefficient. And this shows the more recent situation. During the period of rapid growth, the earliest stages of reform, let's say from 1980 for about 2 decades, all the way coming forward to 2005, steady increase in inequality. But this was also a period of rapid increase in wages. So everybody was better off, but some people were just gaining a lot more income compared to others. But then this second graph shows the more recent development of the same data for Gini coefficient. It has modified modestly because the government realized that there is too much inequality, and especially they tried to introduce a number of safety net measures, income support programs, to support the ones with lowest income, and that has resulted in a stability of Gini. Of course, going above that is really dangerous, but this is again among the high Gini values relative to other countries. So you have a good progress in creating wealth, but certain amount of inequality. And here is another graph that demonstrates the progress in fighting poverty, percent of people that are considered poor. Look at how rapidly it has come forward. And it's practically eliminated by now. And then you have the per capita income per household increasing very rapidly. Part of the reason that inequality has increased is because urban incomes in urban areas have grown a lot faster than rural areas. Okay. So this is a image of the fact that still you have people that live on very low standard of living, not necessarily poverty, but low standard of living. And then you have those who have joined the modern sector. So here is image of a Chinese city. You can see all of those modern high-rise buildings that middle class use. And then you have the people, relatively lower income, in these makeshift houses that you observe here. Okay. Now, the process of unequal growth that we mentioned means that, as you can see, there is now clear inequality among the provinces of China. The ones that were receiving foreign investment, the ones that government had selected for rapid growth. The coastal provinces have per capita incomes which are much larger than inland provinces, especially in eastern regions of China or the remote regions in the north. To make a comparison, this is the condition of Gini coefficient, or another way of measuring inequality, which shows the share of wealth that belongs to the top 20%. And look at how it has changed over time. This is Federation of Russia, highly unequal from beginning, especially after the collapse of Soviet Union. You can see that there was large concentration. This indicates that more than 65% of the national wealth belongs to top 10%. But look at how it has increased for China. So in China also now you have a class that's very wealthy, comparable to Russia. First of all, let's look at this one to show you what was the condition of bureaucracy. One of the tendencies of communist countries, single-party countries, is that because government has so much power, bureaucracy grows. And look at how the number of people working in bureaucracy has increased. This is just about 1982. I think it has stabilized a little bit now, but there was this period of rapid growth. So nearly 20 million people worked in Chinese bureaucracy when the reforms were introduced. And now we come to the theory that this political scientist, YuenYUen Ang, has introduced. So she is now in Johns Hopkins University. She wrote this famous book, which I have a copy of. Right here, as you can see, the picture is right here as well. She was in University of Michigan. So she, for her, I believe it was for her PhD thesis, traveled throughout China. She's originally from Singapore, and spoke to mayors, to governors, to private citizens, business owners, to find out what happened from 1980 coming forward. And she wrote a book called How China Escaped the Poverty Trap. Take a look at that picture. It is right here. And this area is just around one of these hills. That was 1981. There was little development. And now same region, the city of Guangzhou. Has anyone been to Guangzhou from our Chinese students? This is now just like a typical well-developed Chinese city, as you can see, with high-rises. Okay. So this is the transformation, and here you can see the poverty of these children. Back then, poverty by 1980s was quite prevalent. So, the main question that she addresses in this book is why China could succeed as a developmental state. And we already talked about developmental state, a single-party country that focuses on economic growth and development. After 1980, even though when we study the bureaucracy of China, we see that bureaucracy doesn't have those good qualities of a professional Western bureaucracy that Max Weber explained. Nevertheless, China has been able to succeed in massive economic growth and also in reducing poverty. And that was the key question that she addressed. And she argued that the reason for it is what she calls the coevolutionary process. She said, we do not have a situation in China when bureaucracy was first professionalized, and then a professional, efficient bureaucracy facilitated economic growth. It was a dynamic interaction between economic growth and reforms of the bureaucracy, what we call a positive cycle of positive feedback, which is called coevolutionary process. And this is what it is. It says it doesn't matter from which pole you start. You can start by improving governance a little bit. That will result in economic growth. But economic growth in China actually created incentives for the government to introduce more good reforms in bureaucracy. And then, because bureaucracy had improved and became more supportive of economic activity, there was more economic growth, and this cycle continued. This is the coevolutionary process. And this is what I wanted you to write when I asked you to tell me what you know about today's reading. So if you are aware of this, you are successful. So a little bit about the details of this process, of how China managed to escape poverty. So it said, first, accept the fact that the institutions of the country are weak. You do not have perfect private property. You do not have a perfect judicial system. But let's start with what we have. Let's introduce markets with these weak institutions, even though some institutions are weak. Then create the right conditions for adaptation, meaning that give those directors of bureaucracy incentives to say, we want to introduce market, so if you help us introduce the market and the market is successful, market mechanism, for example, for attracting capital, for creating market for trade, then you will also be better off. So most of these were introduced by Deng Xiaoping. So Deng was the leader that contributed a lot to this process of change. If we have time, I'll tell you stories about what he did and his travels throughout China, which are very famous. So he was the one who really managed this coevolution by trying to motivate the bureaucracy to support the reforms. Okay, the key factor that contributed to the success was that the local leaders were rewarded for creating prosperity, and local governments were allowed to keep their revenue. So this is a component of this coevolutionary process. The other key factor that made it successful was that the rate of political economic coevolution was unequal. This has to do with those unequal growth among provinces. The takeoff stage, in terms of takeoff of this process of economic growth, took place in the coastal provinces. And then afterwards, the growth engine, the growth process was extended to inland provinces. So that means that the foreign investment first flew into coastal provinces, and then as investment, both domestic and foreign investment, increased and intensified in coastal provinces, then that was transferred into inland. So one of the interesting things about Chinese government is that every province not only has an official name, but a name that sort of explains some kind of nice thing about it, or a feature that stands out. For example, Zhejiang province is called the Blessed Country. Fujian has a label called the forest hill, and Hubei is called the humble country. So very often when government of China wants to implement a policy, they also come up with these nice slogans to describe what they're doing. There's sometimes even rhyme and poetry of what they like to accomplish. So that's where these names come from. Nevertheless, we see the fact that unequal development means selecting certain regions for first stage and then moving that to the next stage. So let's learn about this coevolutionary process a little bit more, because that was just very, very, very abstract way of demonstrating it. So you have two ways of improving the economy, because it's coevolution. You can start with weak bureaucracy. From that bureaucracy, you make a little bit of improvement and create professional agencies. That is an improvement in bureaucracy. So you can start as a first step, a small step in bureaucracy. And that will create incentives for influx of investment and high growth. What does this mean? This means that government becomes more professional in its behavior, but not all the way to 100%. The other one is to go from poor economy, you inject massive resources, and then you come into improved governance and a strong state. So you could have first improvement in bureaucracy, then economic growth, or you could have first improvement in economy, and then that leading to improvement in the behavior of bureaucracy. And YuenYUen Ang argues that through this cycle, both of these took place. There was continuous coevolution, success in the private sector, success in improvement of the bureaucracy. So, as one way of showing that, imagine this process, a three-step process. Then you go to step 2. You have a strong emerging markets. Because of that, with that, you simply change the rules and you have emerging markets. And then, because of these improvements and incentive mechanisms, you go into strengthening the bureaucracy that is supposed to support the market mechanism. So back and forth between bureaucracy and market, bureaucracy and market. That is the coevolutionary